welcome you to today's webinar titled The Digital Driving and the Future of Dignified Job Tech in Africa, which is a research piece written by Dr. Julie Zollmann. Today's webinar is hosted by the Jobtech Alliance. And I wanted to just give us a quick introduction to our panelists today before kind of running us through the agenda, which will include a presentation by Dr. Zollmann, as well as a panel. We're very fortunate to have with us three panelists, two including Julie, who are Ofense Mokwena from Uber, as well as Mark Leichena from CIFF. And so I would like to go ahead and just kind of introduce our speakers today. We will have an opportunity for question and answer sessions after the panelists are done. And just in terms of house rules, as with all other large groupings of individuals on Zoom, if we can stay muted in terms of how we're going to engage around the question and answer session, we'll actually be taking your questions through the chat section. I think that will allow us to be efficient and maximize the time that we have and ensure that we can get to as many questions as possible towards the end of today's session. So without further ado, introductions of our panelists today. So we're joined by Dr. Julie Zollmann. She's a researcher who uses the tools of economics and anthropology to understand how ordinary people use technology and finance to navigate their economic lives. She has a particular interest and expertise in sub-Saharan Africa and translating research into real-life solutions. She just completed and defended her PhD at the Fletcher School, where she was studying the impact of job matching platforms on labor markets, and during which time she was able to garner the insights that she'll be sharing with us today. Our first panelist our additional panelist is Mr. Ofense Mokwena, and he's the head of public policy for Uber South Africa. He's based out of Johannesburg. His experience spans both public sector and private sector work on crucial transportation and public transportation issues. He holds a PhD from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and his areas of focus was on the far-reaching transportation problem of blending transport economics, behavioral economics, and transport engineering dimensions. Last but not least, we're joined by Mark Leichena, and he's a leader at CIFF, which is a donor, and he's based out of Nairobi. And focuses on developing and managing investments focused on girls' education and young women's livelihood. He's passionate about increasing opportunity and agency for young people and supporting and building African leaders. And so if I could ask Julie to go ahead and share her presentation with us, that'd be great. Thanks so much, Julie. Julie, if you don't mind, thanks so much.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for all of you for joining and for the Jobtech team for creating this space. And I'm just thrilled that Mark and Ofense are here today to push our discussion even further. I think we'll have a really lively discussion. So I'm going to only take a short amount of time to cover some few insights and provocations to get us started today. When I got started on this project, I was really excited about what new kinds of job opportunities that were being digitally mediated might mean for ordinary people in Kenya. I'd been doing research here in Kenya on people's livelihoods and financial lives since 2010. And when Uber first arrived here in 2015, I expected that it might mean something different to workers in Kenya than it did in the West. There were a few reasons that these kinds of markets like Kenya's are so different. And the first is that there are very few good jobs in Kenya. Rather than moving away from employment, here we see digital mediated work being a step towards potentially more formality. Only about 15% of workers in Kenya have what we would consider formal jobs. And in my own interviews with those kinds of workers, these are not great jobs. They are often marked by long hours, mistreatment, and few opportunities to grow. And many informal jobs actually aspire to move into self-employment. Self-employment is seen as aspirational for its ability to create the kinds of flexibility that allow people to layer multiple kinds of incomes on top of one another, have incomes that are upwardly flexible, and to get rid of some of the indignities of disrespectful bosses and workplaces. But we also see that demand is very constrained. So median consumption expenditure here in Nairobi is only about 11,000 shillings per month. That means there are limits to how much people are spending on services like taxis and how much they'll pay for such services. When ride-hailing started in the US, it was considered to be part of what's called the sharing economy. The expectation was that those who already had cars would use them to, in their spare time, to put those idle assets to use. Well, in Kenya, we don't really have this kind of idea of an idle asset. Few Kenyans had cars sitting around with nothing to do, and taxi drivers made big investments to buy a car or rent one from an owner on a monthly basis. Particularly when Uber was new, there were high standards for cars to get onto the platform, and many drivers bought newly imported cars so that they could participate. So here, earnings really needed to justify the full cost of a vehicle ownership, where that would be less true in places like the United States. In Nairobi, we also have enormous economic segregation. The kinds of matchmaking that platforms do can provide important value by connecting those of lower means who are looking for work to those of higher means who are looking for a reliable service. The safeguards around a platform like background checks and star ratings provide some trust infrastructure that makes those transactions possible. And finally, in the global south, we have a challenge around regulation. First, regulators have some limited flexibility in what they might do to rein in the private sector when they're very eager to appear open and welcoming to investors. And even if they want to regulate a new space, they have fewer resources to develop, monitor, and enforce smart regulation. So for all of these reasons, I suspected that what Jobtech and these platforms might mean in Kenya would be very different than the West. And I thought this was a really important opportunity to look at a quickly maturing sector in an environment with exploding numbers of platforms and a very digitally forward populace. So at the time that I was getting started, there were about 118 platforms already active in Nairobi, and transport was a major one that was already maturing. So I thought this is a great way to look at an early maturing sector in a real harbinger economy. And I was eager to capture data that would help us move beyond what I saw as two conflicting narratives about this type of work. On one hand, you had development optimists heralding the possibility of these new forms of work to create new jobs, to bring new efficiencies and new forms of flexibility to workers in the global south. On the other hand, you had a lot of skeptics who feared that this was capitalist exploitation that was shifting all the risks of work onto workers themselves and subordinating them to unfair algorithmic management. Scholars seem to feel that this was not actual entrepreneurship and wondered whether it was fair to represent this kind of change as anything close to development. Both of these narratives struggled with a data question. We didn't have the data to really answer the question about whether platforms were creating many jobs and whether these jobs were any good. That would require measuring income, but also less tangible things like flexibility. And while there were some studies around these issues appearing in the United States, that was not common in the global south. So I was hoping to fill some of these gaps, and in particular around understanding job quality. I worked with a team of 25 researchers to do a quantitative survey of 450 drivers around Nairobi. We initially recruited them by hailing trips around the city using randomized GPS points, and then invited them into our study. We started with 530 drivers and ended with 450 who shared their income and expenditure data weekly over 6 weeks and allowed us to get screenshots of their weekly summaries from the app companies to verify their earnings data. A real limitation of this work is that I'm only able to see this one snapshot in time. This was around the end of 2019. And so this quantitative work doesn't show us the long-term impacts of things like COVID, changes in fuel prices, and changes that might have been induced by regulations that came into effect at the end of last year. We also did quite a bit of qualitative work with drivers in Nairobi and Mombasa, with some of the app companies, driver organizations, and a couple of government officials. One thing that we were able to do with our data is just get a better idea of who drivers are. So we found that they were overwhelmingly male, about 97% in our sample. They were also mostly using this as their main livelihood. So 88% in our sample considered this their main income rather than a side hustle. And that's far greater than in many US cities. And another interesting point here, which is relevant in Nairobi, is that about 51% of drivers were renting their car on a weekly basis from a car owner rather than owning their own cars, which was only about 19% who owned them outright and about 30% who were paying off a loan. That has really important implications for the earnings that drivers were able to achieve. Now, as the project evolved, dignity became my central focus. And I saw that this theme was coming through in several different dimensions. It definitely came into play when people talked about their earnings, but also in terms of driver voice and associational power, and the respect that they felt that they received while doing their work. So I have academic papers in progress on all of these at various stages of a long academic publishing process. But today I want to focus on a few things I learned that I think are relevant to how we think of the future of job tech more generally in markets like Kenya's. First is the reality that it's really hard to create lots of new jobs in place-based work where you're pulling on a limited pool of demand. We see that customer numbers and driver numbers increased dramatically as prices were slashed. That allowed more customers to enter the market in Kenya, and for more drivers to be pulled into the platforms. Those driver numbers kept growing, but surely had to plateau. Around the end of 2019, Uber alone had about 13,000 drivers, and most of the drivers that we spoke with were on Uber plus one or two other apps. So there might have been more than 13,000 total in the market, but I think that's a pretty nice, pretty helpful benchmark. That's a lot of drivers, but they needed to also, but the platforms were also absorbing existing drivers. So we don't know how many new jobs were really created by platforms, maybe half. For a fairly mature sector and in a country of 50 million, that's important in terms of job creation, but still rather modest. Second, while digital management is often critiqued in the academic literature, I found that under the right circumstances, and in markets like ours, it can be dignity enhancing. The alternative that most workers have when they're working is not a dignified job with lots of protections and fair treatment. It's often working on your own, hustling in the wilds of Nairobi's informal economy. And that alone entails a lot of indignities. So what they said in contrast is that digitization provided some dignity gains. So about 78% of our drivers in late 2019 considered their work dignified. And when we dug into what they meant, they told us that having and enforcing digital rules like background checks, insurance requirements, and star ratings made them legible to their riders as professionals. Their clients saw them as professional drivers. And these rules also enforced a sectoral discipline that dignified their work. They felt their work was more formal, a quote, job like any other, we were often told. It was legal and recognized. They also told us that digital matchmaking connected them to high status riders, giving them a sense of importance and belonging. The possibility that they might own a car one day, and that would also elevate their social status, was also important. So this was actually not a simple exploitation narrative. Lots of drivers told us that this gave them a chance to have dignified work, maybe for the first time, that they could work full time, that their neighbors saw them taking their lunch to work, and that was itself dignified. However, these dignity gains were undermined by low earnings. Very few of those in our study, and especially those who did not own their own cars, were making above hourly earnings or monthly earnings that exceeded Kenya's minimum wage for drivers in the city. So you can see the graph on the left, this is the percentage of the drivers in our study in each of these segments that were earning above minimum wage. So only 8% of those drivers working for partners were getting take-home wages above minimum wage, and only 34% of them on a monthly basis. So in order to get these monthly targets, they were working about 60 hours a week, and that was 6 days a week, really long hours to make up for their fixed costs and to take home a decent wage. But the earnings undermine their dignity for other reasons. To them, it also signaled socially that they weren't valued in society. So one person I remember telling me that he was once sent in Diani to pick up someone's dogs and put them in the car. And for a very low fare that wouldn't have even covered the cost of vacuuming the car afterwards. Someone told me that if he carries a client for a very low wage, it looks as if he's worthless, like they're just helping him, like he's not earning a wage, but just getting some kind of handout that's a favor or appreciation from their riders. But these low wages don't necessarily stem from evil companies trying to extract as much as they possibly can from their drivers. These wages are a result from structural forces, such as the competition among apps that's really forcing them to cut wages in order to gain market share. The lack of car ownership also makes it a challenge. So we have a lot lower earnings while people are trying to buy a car or paying off rent. We have misaligned incentives where apps have the incentive to keep as many drivers around and available as possible, even if that means more drivers are on the road, unable to get plenty of trips. We also have volatile fuel prices that are completely outside the control of the app companies and shareholder pressures facing app companies. So ultimately, when we look at the impact of ride hailing in Kenya, we see a series of contradictory and contingent outcomes, not a clear story in either direction. We see that technology can increase people's dignity, but low wages can undermine those gains. That this kind of work might not be objectively good, but it can be better than alternatives that are available. And we have to reckon with the reality of what those alternatives look like in different markets. And we see that earnings can be much higher for workers, but only if they own their own car. So they're getting better returns to their capital than their labor. And we see that there's constant change. Fares are constantly changing, regulation, and the costs that workers are facing. So what does this tell us about the future of job tech in Africa? I have a few ideas, and I can't wait to hear what Afense and Mark have to say. So I feel like, for one, the potential for massive job creation may be overstated in place-based work, where we're selling into the same markets in which workers are selling their services. Second, I think digitization can help professionalize work and result in dignity gains. And there are especially gains where those rules are enforced even more strictly, rather than vice versa. Dignity gains still are contingent on decent pay, and pay can be volatile, especially in maturing and competitive sectors. But pay is in part a function of structural forces, not just greedy platform companies. And we really need to pay attention more to those structural issues, especially from those of us who are ecosystem players. Finally, objective, long-term, and responsive data collection will be needed to get regulation right. Regulation will need to be experimental. We'll need to learn as we go. This is new territory for most economies, and yet most economies also lack the apparatus to track change over time and to monitor the impacts of their regulations on the welfare of workers. That's it from me. Back to you, Watsi.
Thanks so much, Dr. Zollmann, for a really insightful presentation. I think you do a really great job of incorporating worker voices while also very much highlighting the complexity of some of the sort of system-related complexities and pressures that lead to the dynamic we're faced with, which is this trade-off between dignity work and possibilities of income and the like. So I wanted to start us off by maybe positing a question to Mark from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Really curious to hear from you. Just, what some of your thinking has been in this space around the trade-offs that are entailed between reaching more users, so a higher quantity of jobs, and helping companies grow, versus the imperative to ensure that these new jobs that are created are still dignified and constitute decent work.
Sure. Thanks so much, Wadsy. And that was a really, really interesting presentation, Julie, that sort of challenged me to think about how do we measure success here. Just to share a bit of context. So yeah, so as mentioned, I work for CIFF, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, which is a UK headquartered philanthropic foundation, although I'm in Nairobi, lots of colleagues in Nairobi and Addis, so sort of very much here on the continent focused on this work. At CIFF, we support digital livelihoods work under our Girl Capital portfolio, which includes CIFF work in girls' education, sexual and reproductive health and livelihoods, and really working towards a goal of we want every girl to have the chance to have an education, earn the same as men, and be able to choose if and when she has a family. And I think sort of the reflection we have here, I mean, the motivation for the focus on livelihoods is because lack of power is at the root cause of so many of these challenges, and the ability to work, own money, earn money and control how it's spent is key, both for empowering individuals, but also for changing norms within communities. And I guess to get to the specific question asked, I mean, it is a really interesting, I mean, I think, Julie, what your work challenges me to think about is this metric of number of jobs created is relevant in a world where you assume you don't have work, and then people get employed and now they're in a job and they've gone from not earning to something. And I think some of what this makes me think about is, we need to do a lot better of really just instead thinking about changes in circumstances for participants. To what extent does participation in the digital economy, gig economy, sort of whether part-time, full-time, how much is it impacting in terms of the increase in overall earnings from all sources? How much is it actually changing agency, decision-making, social norms, respect for the people who are doing it, their ability to provide for their families? And if it is, then, and it can clearly do that without, one mechanism for that is how much you earn, but there's other ways. I mean, work can provide community and social connections and all sorts of other things. So I think Julie's work really sort of challenges me to make sure that we're measuring that and ultimately getting to that, rather than just focusing on sort of numbers of people employed as a key target for a funder like CIFF.
Wanted to reach out to a friend say actually, and sort of in response, curious, Mark's brought up this really important issue, which is around measurement, not just quantity, but quality and all the various dimensions. And I know for Uber and for a lot of ride-hailing companies, any tech startup, right? The metric that matters most is the number of users. Curious to understand how Uber tackles and thinks about quality of work, and what your measures around dignity of work for your drivers look like, and considerations that you've thought about in order to enhance the quality of work for your drivers.
Fascinating question, actually fascinating presentation. I mean, when you see the presentation blankly, it's sort of different from when it's presented. So I really enjoyed it. And yeah, thank you so much for having us. Maybe let's think a little bit about like what dignity means, because sometimes we talk about a concept, and a lot of the times there's an assumption that we can pinpoint it, or we're all on the same page in terms of what dignity truly is. So in the business, one of the principles that we operate with is a phrase around see the forest and the trees. And what that means is, from a dignity perspective, it's sort of about, how we look at dignity as a concept that's spread across different experiences, because drivers who come on our platform come from different points of departure in terms of their lives. If you look at Julie's work, it's quite clear that there is a substantial portion of people who are on the platform who did work somewhere before in some shape or form. There are also different types of people, those who have a university degree and those who do not. And what that it suggests then is that there will be people who are coming on the platforms for a variety of reasons. And this uniqueness is something that's very difficult to even capture or understand or pinpoint, because then the benchmark varies from one person to another from an experiential perspective. So when I sort of think about this, maybe dignity is something that's basically inherent in all of us. It's not something that you can earn. It's just the standard finding of being a human, being in this existence, and it's something that we can all enjoy equally at its core. So with that kind of background, like, we know that the dignity of each driver on our platform, or on any platform for a matter of fact, is unique to that particular individual. But there is like a baseline. So how we sort of think through this is in a couple of ways. So one example is the piece that Julie emphasizes, which is the almost this spinal cord of, for example, safety. So, when we see the forest and the trees, we also stand for safety. And by implication, then we build an entire web of safety components. Some of them are in principle, some of them are by design in the tech, some of them are experiential, like whether it's an emergency button or whatever. And they're all designed in such a way that they respond to the body, the whole body of the particular user, whether it's a rider or a driver. These two users would have similar but very different experiences. And it's also designed in such a way that it tries to capture as many unique use cases as possible, just from understanding the spinal cord, the essence of the particular work that needs to be done for a specific customer, whether the customer is a driver or a rider. So what that suggests then is, by design, we try to encapsulate the basic principle of what a person who is using the Uber platform experiences. And the reason why we're so deeply tied into this is because of drivers, right? And if we think about like how we get to this or how we work through this, it's by and large experiential. So some people, academics would say ethnographic or anthropological, or, but in our world, it's very experiential. You have to meet with drivers, whether you're in policy or governance or operations. And in addition to that, sometimes we actually take the trips and provide the service so that we have a real-time experience of how the tech actually interacts with creating this space for a degree of dignity that should be equally accessible across the board.
And a follow-on question, I think Dr. Zollmann did indicate a really critical part, or at least necessary precondition that digital workers typically need to have, including drivers, which is access to assets. So owning a vehicle, and how a large number of drivers actually have to rent, and that eats further into their incomes. I was curious over time what the evolutions you've seen in terms of innovating for access to finance and access to assets. have you put in place or observed being put in place in Uber in order to, in a sense, enhance the take-home pay of drivers?
Imagine this world, right? In 2 years, we'll be in 2025. And if any forecasts are accurate, 1 in every 15 unemployed young person in Africa would be interacting with some kind of platform. Now, what does that mean practically? It means that there are so many layers and so many people who will be affected by this particular piece, especially in areas where there is some type of barrier to entry into a specific marketplace. But what that does, back into like our world, what that does is that when we meet with drivers, we find different types of drivers. So for example, you'd have a driver who owns their vehicle, which is, you know, the example that Julie flagged. And then you'll have a driver that is driving under a fleet. So this would be a formal company that provides a rent to own kind of model, that provides some kind of financial solution, or that provides an employment relationship where the driver is actually hired by this fleet entity. Then you find drivers who own a vehicle and have 3 other vehicles that they rent out to other people. And a lot of them started working on platforms with 1 vehicle or renting vehicles. Now, how are drivers navigating this ecosystem? Some of the things that we're seeing are these cooperatives forming where drivers are basically pooling cash, pooling liquid to purchase vehicles collectively. We're also seeing a resurgence of this, the formal financial, well, self-informed financial cooperative environment where people are building what, say, you see in South Africa as a stokvel, what you see in Nairobi as a cumulative approach to this, where different rental models are happening across drivers and owners in almost different layers. And we're seeing a lot of innovation from the drivers themselves. We're seeing very unique innovations. We're also seeing a lot of corporates or corporations seeing the market and saying, look, can we provide access to vehicles as an original equipment manufacturer? In many cases, these are African businesses that design themselves around this type of market. But the barrier to entry issue, quite frankly, is a huge issue across all entrepreneurship. Well, any type of self-informed work, which people call informal, but it's actually self-informed work, and the broader entrepreneurial and self-employed ecosystem. And we think there's some serious structural reforms that need to happen in order for us to, 1, reflect the realities, and 2, to also accept that as the industry evolves, there'll be much greater independence from what we would see as a traditional financial system. But as a business, so Uber as a tech platform, we sometimes just provide this, what we call a vehicle marketplace, where owners and people who want to do rental models and people who want to just provide these, resources, vehicles to drivers, they can make those available on the platform. But we typically aren't directly involved in that, but we study it and observe it quite a bit.
Thank you. Julie, I had a question for you, maybe that can help us, give us a little more, how can I put it, color to some of the really interesting insights you had mentioned. When we talk about dignity, Mark makes reference to just the importance of measuring and quantifying what quality looks like. I think it was interesting that in the responses you got from the drivers that you interviewed, a lot of the terminology they used was around felt sense. So it was things like dignity associated with status, professionalism. As you kind of worked through the data, I'm curious to understand on the balance of things where a need to have an income and look after you, so the numbers, right? The revenue generation side of things versus the felt sense of what dignity means and how it computed for the workers that you engaged.
There's been a lot of questions in the chat as well about how do we understand what decent work looks like, especially these non-financial dimensions. And let me just say, there's a lot of scholarship on this already, and I went into a lot of that in my dissertation and chose a sort of simplified model to look at. But the ILO's Decent Work Framework, the Fair Work Foundation's Fair Work Principles are trying to get at that. But when I started off, I wanted to really understand like what really matters to Kenyan workers, because some challenges that we face in these global models is that there might be things in those models that are not relevant here. So one thing that I did as I was starting this work was to talk with about 50 young people in different kinds of platform sectors of the economy that were being affected by platforms, and that was quite diverse. And I talked to them about their work experiences and their conceptions of what made a job good. And I think one thing that came out really clearly is that income is always first. And I think, so when I talk about dignity and others talk about dignity, I think we need to make sure that we're not saying that these factors of flexibility and respect are substitutes for an income that is itself undignified and lesser than you, makes you feel like you're not part of society, because that's absolutely, all dignity is also contingent on pay that feels respectable, fair, and livable. And so that's really at the center, and that's one reason that I put so much effort into really accurately measuring drivers' net earnings. So I think we can't remove that from the picture. And then these other dimensions I think are a bit contextual. So we were trying to see, when drivers said their work was dignified, why? What does that mean to them? Was a really specific question. I think another issue that we talk a lot about in relation to Jobtech is flexibility. And so when workers talked about flexibility, I saw that they meant something very different than I think we meant as scholars from the West when we were thinking about flexibility and gig work. Whereas we in the West were thinking flexibility means you can work when you want. Flexibility means you don't need to let anyone know if you're going on vacation. But I also saw that for them, there were limits to that flexibility, because if you need to work 60 hours a week to both pay your partner and to take home some pay, that's a limit to your flexibility. That meant in terms of, that is a major reason where I think we are so few women in this space. Because if you need to work 60 hours a week, and especially in rush hour and mornings and evenings, that really limits the time that you can be at home with your kids. So when we're talking about on-demand labor, we're talking about being flexible to the demands of the people buying the goods and services at the times that are important to them. And whether that means in the ride-hailing sector in Nairobi, or if you're doing digital outsourcing, serving your clients in the UK or US time zones, you're sort of responding to them. So I think it's really important when we talk about these other dimensions, the non-financial dimensions of quality of work, that as we're applying frameworks to new settings, that we take seriously what workers' experiences are and interrogate some of those principles, like what does dignity mean? What does flexibility mean in this context?
So you touched on briefly, Julie, another important thing. So a very stark stat that you mentioned was 97% of the drivers were men. leaving, 3% were women. Of the women that you spoke to, were they, I know it wouldn't have been a large part of your subset, but curious to understand if there were any divergences in what they had to share about their experiences.
So we went out of our way to try to contact women during the qualitative stage of the work to try to understand that better. And I expected I would hear some issues around security, but actually the digital mediation and rule enforcement, especially on platforms that enforce their rules very strictly, like Uber, safety wasn't a major concern for women. And in fact, again, here, these communities of drivers themselves that were communicating on WhatsApp with one another provided some additional assurances of safety, or help if you have a flat tire or a car trouble, that someone around the area is going to come to your assistance. So a lot of that wasn't an issue. And what was really the issue was women trying to find a balance between needing to work long hours to economically make this work for them, and having competing needs at home to get their kids ready for school, to pick them up from school, ready for bed, and things like that. And so being unable to meet those, to work during those peak hours and to work long hours. So the women who were in our sample and still driving tended to be those who had a car within the family already and could do this as a very, very much a part-time endeavor.
I'm going to shift over to Mark with questions around, and this is a question that's popped up a lot in the chat, which is just around the role that donors can play, donors and impact investors in improving work dignity, and kind of carrying on the thread from what Julie just shared with us as we kind of are forward looking in terms of solutioning and creating opportunities. Two questions basically is just around the role that donors can play in increasing the space and the participation of women, and secondly, in general, improving the quality of work for workers working in digitally intermediated spaces.
Sure, and just I'll just jump in. One thing Julie was saying, which is really interesting there, that I was just reflecting on at the end, was about kind of the gendered impacts and how much gender roles in terms of what women have to do play a factor here. And it does make me think about the two sides of this. I mean, in some of CIFF's other work, for example, in agriculture, which is a bit further ahead in terms of really measuring this, there's a recognition that, there's also work within communities with strong social norms, so that partners, husbands, male community members can recognize that actually sort of the only way that women will be able to participate in certain economic areas is changing and shifting who does play certain roles. And so it does make me think about how much it's that versus also how much it's recognizing, how do you make these jobs meet the needs of women coming into them. I think, for the question of the role that donors can play, there's obviously a few different pieces and aspects to that. I think traditionally, a lot of what's happened has been, support for skilling, has been support for helping accelerate or support businesses, especially with specific goals, move along in this type of direction. But I do think increasingly what we will see here is sort of similar to the types of things you see in you see in economies where this is more developed. It's donors supporting worker focused activities as well, supporting workers engaging within community in terms of sharing voice on policy issues, in terms of thinking about how do you address some of the care economy or other types of pieces like that. How do you support governments as they start to think about accountability in some of these different areas? And I think you see different donors finding different roles, and obviously some partners it's easier to fill certain roles based on their mandate or the role that they've historically played. But I think you'll see different donors engaging in different ways on that.
And I guess I'm curious, Mark, just about, the one of the things that Julie would have mentioned, in addition, has just been around sort of insight generation. In your experience, I guess from a donor agency standpoint, what are some of the ways in which we could unlock insights for advocacy and policy and regulation support?
Well, I mean, obviously, clearly bringing the sector together in the ways like the Jobtech Alliance is doing is a great thing to do. I do think, of course, there is going to be the question of power and voice at the table, and the respective level of power that businesses have, that other stakeholder groups have. I think is going to be a key factor, a key factor in this. So I think there is clearly a need of insights, but the question is also who has those in, who has the ability to bring those insights with authority to have decisions made based on them. And I think that's going to be a key question, especially in countries like Kenya in this over time.
I think as the Jobtech sector evolves, and in general, any kind of technological innovations typically emerge before regulators have had the opportunity to consider what the implications are and what the required policy shifts might need to be that would create an enabling environment, not only for businesses to flourish, but for workers to be protected and to be able to participate meaningfully in the job tech space. I am curious if Fense, what kind of regulatory shifts you've seen or have advocated for in recent times within your policy function that you feel have expanded opportunities for workers?
Well, there are quite a few pieces to this. So, for example, maybe if we start with something as basic as if you listen to Julie's point around flexibility, right? Especially in the African economy, when we look at what this means from a regulatory perspective, the first thing that comes to mind is, a lot of the evidence highlights that platforms are filling some kind of void in the regulatory world, and there's a lot of need for appropriate data relationships, for high quality and very accurate regulatory frameworks to exist. But at the same time, there's also a need for a regulatory posture that enables entrepreneurship. And by that, I mean, like, whether it's from a access to financing perspective, and not just for vehicles, but I mean broadly, like, because a lot of the times people on platforms are also open to expanding their ability to participate in the economy. So top of mind, I'll say maybe three major puzzle pieces. The first one is issues around the how flexible social protections can coexist with the existing ecosystem. For example, when drivers are independent contractors, entrepreneurs, running their own businesses, or self-employed, somewhere in between different types of work, or they're doing this, during the day. The issue is, how do they then participate or contribute for themselves independently into social protections? And in most cases, in many markets, the pathway does not exist for that. And it doesn't exist because of historical reasons, because self-informed or self-employed work, is considered informal, and therefore there's no legitimate way to monitor participation. But what we're seeing is that there's a lot of appetite, at least in the policy circles, to see, how can self-employed individuals really have access to protections and benefits at their own accord, at joint accords with, with broader platforms, and how that plays out when someone is using more than one platform, which is typically the case. So that's one. And then second one, in view of time, second one has to do with, the issue around sector specificity from a regulatory perspective, right? So a lot of times the regulatory instruments target the cost of the operation and not necessarily the value of the operation, whether it's for drivers, fleet partners, or the platforms. And I think that just highlights a gap between, what's happening in reality and what is assumed. So the observation would be that the industry is designed as a meter taxi kind of space or traditional transport space, whereas it's not. It's really an extension of what typically exists in this kind of environment. So those are like the two major puzzle pieces: just flexibility in terms of access to social protections across the board, not just for those in the job tech space. And then secondly, sector specificity in terms of, understanding how regulations should actually empower and enable entrepreneurship at scale.
Julie, I'd love to hear your response to the same question. You just shared in the chat a really interesting article around regulation and ride hailing. And I think from a worker perspective also would have had the opportunity to engage firsthand, at least to understand where workers are coming from. So it would be great to hear your response on that. And then secondly, also popping up conversations around KRA and other social solidarity movements, and wanted to hear what your experience was and what insights you were able to generate during your research on that.
Let me start with the regulation question. I think what we have seen in ride hailing at this sector really got to maturity, and there's this fierce competition that is really squeezing drivers at the middle. And that competition has been unregulated until the end of last year. And I don't have I don't have too many high hopes for that new regulation. I would have wanted to see something different. But one key challenge is that we have very little use of data to both make that determination and revise it later down the road. It wasn't even clear sort of what's the priority, what's the objective of this regulation. So I think as we think about, I think we don't want to push for over-regulating sectors before they sort of get some momentum, but here we had the momentum come and it came really fast. And I think it took the regulators by surprise, and they were left settling a political battle rather than being able to really thoughtfully think about this from a technical perspective. So I would say from regulation, it needs to have clear objectives. Are we trying to maximize like the utility for users? Are we trying to make sure that some standards of worker protections are in place, et cetera? And when it comes to those worker protections, I think a really key and simple thing that is relevant in the global South, where we have very limited resources for regulators and in terms of developing policies and also enforcing them, would be to limit the pace with which operators can revise their terms and conditions, so that drivers can make a decision about something like buying a car with a set of terms and conditions that are fairly predictable about the next 3 years. As it is now, they don't know what the terms will be from month to month, and that's really put them in a pickle, not to mention when something like COVID hits, or a fuel price shock like we've seen globally, or elections in Kenya. And the trouble with those things is that they hit all the drivers at once. I think Offensa is very correct that people have been self-insuring for a very long time, and these solidarity groups among drivers are a really powerful force for helping out when a driver gets in an accident, when a driver needs a major car repair. They're not so good when everybody's income drops by 30% because elections are coming, or during an enormous shock like COVID. And so there, I think we need to be a little bit careful and also creative and realistic that these are not the most vulnerable members of society. So from a developmental perspective, whether there should be subsidized kinds of social protection mechanisms is, I think, really important for donors to recognize that like there's a lot of need in these places, and so we should be cautious about what kinds of solutions we suggest at this end of the market. I think you had something else, Wadzi, and I lost the train of thought.
You did a great job of actually blending and roping it in together, which was some of the social solidarity related aspects. So we're coming up on sort of 4 minutes to the hour. And I wanted to give each of our panelists the opportunity to give their sort of closing reflections on some of what we've discussed today. And I'll start with Mark, then we can have Ofense and end off with Julie.
Yeah, thanks so much, Wadzi, and thanks for the invitation to come on. I mean, I think what I appreciate, as has been said by others at the start, I mean, what I loved about this discussion today is it's centered around what we're actually hearing from workers, and recognizing that actually the individuals here are the experts on their own experiences, and I think it'll be really key for us to ground it here. I do think, I mean, Julie's point around the question of where donors focus around this is certainly a valid one on both sides. I mean, because on the one hand, as is said, I mean, there's a question around coming in and thinking about additional social protections sort of beyond some of these challenges. On the other hand, of course, a lot of folks came to this space in a hope that it would deliver huge job creation and economic impact really quickly. And there's potentially a risk of sort of overselling and sort of disappointment in terms of some of these areas. And so it seems like this is a key area for continued research to understand and see what's possible, and to recognize that sort of in the same way that funders or others or founders may make decisions about entering spaces based on what they see the opportunities are, we'll also see young Kenyans and other Africans voting for with their feet based on the types of opportunities they see. So it does feel like there's just a lot more for us all to share here. I mean, on the side at CIFF, we'll continue having our focus really on sort of the quality and impact on young people, and especially young women's lives from this work, and hopefully also continuing to put resources to support young people exercising their voices to call out where sectors and other challenges don't meet these needs. But I can see that we'll all be moving forward together, and I'm really grateful to see this type of research and keep engaging. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. Offense.
Well, what I can say is that very grateful for the discussion today, and quite frankly, there's a lot of conversation that we'll need to have, of course, with the Jobtech Alliance and Julie and everybody, because for us, this kind of conversation is more of a working session, a workshop, where we can translate the talk shop into actual work that needs to be done. So that's how we sort of approach this type of piece. So I think everyone who's here, our door is really open. So you can, send me a ping or any ideas or anything that you'd like to follow up on, so that we can build platforms that actually, serve drivers, delivery people, and everyone, with heart. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Offense. Dr. Zollmann.
Thanks. I really thought this was a great discussion, and I think Mark was really right about the need, especially of us ecosystem builders and donors, to pay attention to the changes in people's circumstances, not just job numbers. And in that respect, to be attentive to the ways that digitization and the ways that digitization manages and connects people affects the experience of workers. And not just definitely on the income side, but also on these other dimensions. Who is it connecting them to? How does it make them feel? What are the elements of fairness involved? We couldn't get into all of those dimensions, but I think it's something that's just helpful to really keep our antenna up for as this space evolves. Thanks so much for a great discussion.
Great. Thank you again, Julie, Mark, Offensive, for your participation. Julie, just excellent research work and such an important contribution to the body of work from a work perspective. And we hope to see more and more of that. And I think from a Jobtech Alliance perspective, the enabling environment component of our work really is around coalescing around these important insights through webinars, publishing newsletters and the like, in order for us to be able to make informed choices and create opportunities for not just the Jobtech sector, but policy actors and donors to come around in a multi-stakeholder forum to create positive change in this sector. I want to thank everybody who showed up for our webinar today, and I hope you found it insightful. Please be on the lookout for additional fora like this that are coming up during the course of the month of March and April. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.